Shoes for Anthony by Emma Kennedy. Read by Emma Kennedy. Chapter 1. Penpick, our mountain. Here she came, rising out from the fog, ground up like a woman quietly raising her petticoats. I loved this time in the morning, when the mountain made her presence felt. The wind blew away the haze of night, and there she was, the queen of the valley. We were standing, the five of us, stolen tea trays tucked into our armpits, staring up towards the spoil tip that sat at her base. It was such a blot on the landscape, and yet, in a way, it fitted right in. Muck and beauty, side by side. "Race up, then race down, right, boys?" said Aid, spitting into his hand. Aid was my best bud. He had a face so ingrained with dirt he looked like the inside of a teapot. He was wearing a pair of muddied shorts, and a jumper so oversized it floated round him as if he were suspended in a well. Nobody had had new clothes in years, certainly not since the start of the war. All the kids on Scott Street were reliant on hand-me-downs and the clothes of the dead. "Onesies, right?" said Thomas Evans, scrap of a thing, tough as hell. He was like Gristle, a chewy lad we called him, forever breaking his limbs. "Start him by there!" He pointed up to a flat section to the left of the heaped-up spoil tip. "But feet up, like, no breaks." We all nodded. "Who's doing starters, then?" asked Bozo, shoving his glasses up his nose. One of the lenses was covered in sticking plaster on account of him having a lazy eye. Plaster was supposed to make his lazy eye less lazy. None of us understood how that worked, mind, but there it was. "I will," said Fez, glancing sideways. Fez was a stick of a lad, all knees and elbows with an explosion of curly blonde hair. He looked like a firework. He lived 3 doors down and was an only child, something that was virtually unheard of in Treherbert. There'd been something wrong with his mam, and she couldn't have any more. That's what Bopa Jackson said. Bopa lived next door to us. She knew everything about everyone. Better than the path they knews, mam said. Still, it meant Fez always had stuff. He was good to hang around. When it came to clambering up spoil tips, the general rule was low and fast. There was a knack to it. Light on the toes, no digging the heels in, don't stand still for any length of time. Easier said than done in rubber Wellingtons, but I'd been climbing spoil tips for as long as I could remember. Up and at it. There was no other way. The 5 of us took up position, slightly bent at the shoulders, one leg forward. We cast each other a sideways glance. "On your mark," I began, getting ready to crouch. "Go!" yelled Fez, and off he dashed, his plimsolls digging in. "Off and den!" yelled Bozo, clambering after him. "That's not starters, that's cheating, you bastard!" I got off to a bad start. My first footfall slid away from me and I tumbled at the off. Falling down into a crouched position, I used my free hand to stabilize and began to make inroads upwards. Fez was already a quarter of the way up. He was darting left and right, taking a leaping zigzag approach towards the summit. I'd seen him do that before. I knew it tired him out. He'd have to stop, and when he did, he'd slide down. Bozo was struggling. For every 2 steps forward, he was slipping a step back. He had good balance on his left side, but his right was letting him down. That would be his lazy eye, I thought. Aid and Thomas were neck and neck, just below Fez, but higher up than me. I glanced up. There were miniature gullies in the spoil tip. You didn't want to run up those. The clinkers tended to be finer, less stable. You wanted to run up the harder stuff. It had less of a tendency to fall away. I looked over towards Fez. He was slowing down. I clawed myself forwards with my free hand and tried to push myself up onto my toe tips. A light touch and high knees. That's what was needed. It wouldn't look pretty, but it would get the job done. I got myself into a rhythm. High knees, touch and up. I was passing Thomas. He looked red in the face, exhausted already. Aid was within reaching distance. I checked his position. He was about 10 feet from the top, but almost at a standstill. Touch and up. My left foot hit a gully and slid away. I managed to stay upright, but the heels of my Wellingtons wanted to dig backwards. I had to push forwards. Bozo was nowhere. He was out of it. Aid and Thomas were flagging. It was just me and Fez. I could hear him breathing, heavy, laboured. He was finished. He'd have to crawl the last bit. My legs felt strong. I had him. Push, jump and pass.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?